So my name is Emily, and I'm here today as a graduate student in the clinical psychology department at the University of Maine, talking today about what psychologists should do from our point of privilege as part of the Black Lives Matter movement. I'm here today with my very close friend, Nic, and she's going to tell us a little bit about herself, and we're going to get to talking. So hello, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hello. So my name is Nic. I went to the same undergrad as our undergrad university is Emily, so that's how we initially met. And we've continued to have really great discussions around like race and like police brutality, not just like for like the past like few months when everything has really spiked up, but for the past like few years, which has been a really great part of our relationship. So I'm really happy to be here today. Go ahead.
Do you want to just talk a little bit more about like what you do in your job?
Yeah, for sure. So as a sex ed health educator, my specific focus for the past year has been women's health, and not just like cis women, but also trans women as well, since the rates of cis Black women, specifically for HIV/AIDS diagnoses, has gone up in the past few years, unfortunately. And while those rates of diagnoses are not as high as queer men or rising. So it really just draws attention to the fact that we really need to pay attention to women of color within the realm of healthcare, not just having them seek out help, but also retaining their care overall within our healthcare system, whether that is like HIV/AIDS related, sexual health related, or if it is just like general prevention or preventative care with like doctor's appointments and things like that. So yes, just really like increasing the trust between women of color and their healthcare provider is mainly what I do. Yeah, just helping people out.
So advocacy is a big part of what you do.
Yes, absolutely.
And something near and dear to your heart.
Yeah. Yep.
And you also have a degree in psychology. So I know you're saying you're not a healthcare professional, but you do have knowledge of psychology.
Yes, I do. I've taken many a class and it's been a great time. And even though psychology wasn't necessarily my specialty, it was still something that was really important to me, especially being like a person of color, and having like, I think now at this point in my life, I've had like 10 therapists or like people who have like prescribed me medication, therapists, psychologists, and only one of them has been a person of color. So just like going through the dynamics of understanding like what that looks like why I haven't had a therapist or a mental health professional who has been of color, and like what that means, and really dissecting that. It's a lot of what we're gonna chat about as the session goes on, but yeah, it's just like a really interesting piece of like awareness for myself and like my history with therapy or like the psychology field.
Yeah, it's definitely a big problem not having a very diverse group of mental health care professionals available. So yeah, I think it's time that we can just dive right into it. So it's a big first question, but what can psychologists and mental health care professionals in general do to be better advocates for Black Lives Matter and other things of that nature?
Yeah, absolutely. And I really appreciate that you included the word like advocate as opposed to ally, because I feel like historically, like ally has had too passive of a context, whereas advocate is much more obviously like taking steps, more manageable, I would say, more dynamic. So I do appreciate the use of that word. And I think there are many things that psychologists and mental health professionals can do. The first is obviously like increasing awareness about the lack of diversity in the psychology field, and helping to mentor young people of color, whether that is like going to schools and talking to youth at like a job fair or something, or just like talking about it, being supportive of like minority associations or groups related to psychology or like the healthcare field. I think that's a really big one, because if people don't see themselves necessarily within a sphere or within a like a business or a field, they often aren't going to be attracted to it because they can't see themselves in it. So I think that's a big one. I think the overarching one that just like is continuous is education. Continuing to educate themselves about obviously not just like the field that they're in, but also how different like races and ethnicities move about in that space and exist in that space. Whether that is like just educating yourself about other Black or people of color therapists or mental health professionals in the area. Also making sure that like you're on top of the like racial dynamics in your city or your state as a whole is super important. Like I can't even imagine the therapists in like the Minneapolis or like Minnesota area right now. I'm sure that they're getting like bombarded with like a bunch of like racial tension or minority stress that's going on. So yeah, keeping a like, whether that's like a Google alert or just like reading the news and touching base with that, and understanding really even or like empathizing with the racial tensions in your area. So education is super incredibly important. Advocating for those folks in the spaces that you're in is also super important, like advocating for the minorities in your area, whether that doesn't necessarily have to be politically as well, but if you are involved in like local organizations and things like that, like look around the table at who's there and make sure that there is a diverse range of voices and people there is super important. I think also just like addressing race or ethnicity or cultural differences between you and your client can also be a big thing. It doesn't necessarily have to be like as soon as like someone walks into your session being like, okay, so you're Asian and I am white, but so what is that like for you? It doesn't have to be like that. It can just because every person who is like of a minority race like experiences racial stress differently based off of their experience. So like the times when it has come up for me is to talk about the dynamic of being like not just Black but also biracial and how that was navigating for me. So and the 3 therapists that I've talked to with it about have all been like white women named Kelly, like all 3 of them. It's so funny. So they've all had different responses, all of which were like very appropriate. But the most memorable one was one of them was like, so clearly I'm not Black. And I was like, wow, Kelly, I had no idea. But she was like, so even though like, obviously like I'm not a Black person, I really like empathize with you and like the struggles that you've had to like overcome. So really just she was able to pivot it back to also like obviously like this is like don't ignore it. Don't ignore the difference that is there. And if you don't see a difference, then that can also be a problem. So understanding the dynamic of that and being able to address it just in like a natural way. And it can also be like a great thing to do would be like, well, if you also like don't feel comfortable talking about this with me, like being a white person and like a Black person, here are some resources for you. So if you don't feel comfortable talking to me about it, there's at least like resources available that where you can feel safe talking about it. And allow that person to respond. Like if they're like, you know what, I actually really don't feel comfortable talking about like my racial trauma and things like that with you, then just like, that's okay. That's totally fine. That just means that like, just like dating, like finding like a right fit between you and your therapist. Yeah, it's like another person. So yes, I think those are a couple different things, but it all comes down to like education and continuing education. And I think also with like clients or other people in the field, anytime that they make like if they do say something to you or someone else that is related to maybe like something that you said, or they say like, oh, like you were biased in the way that you approached this topic, take that into consideration and don't take offense to it. It doesn't mean that you're like a terrible person. It just means that there are some implicit biases there that need to be addressed, and they can be worked through. It may not be necessarily easy, but definitely like over time and like education and like configuring your like your mind, you're able to make those actions a lot more positive.
That's really great. Yeah. And you touched on this a little bit, but having that conversation with a client when there's clearly a difference in the room based on either race or something like that, like maybe it's a client that's identifies as LGBT plus or something like that, that maybe is physically identifiable in some way. How do you think is the best way to start those conversations? Because obviously they can be tough, and I know you've had a lot of different experiences.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think thankfully with like my past experiences, all of my therapists and mental health professionals have been accepting of my queer identity. And I think the best thing, at least in those terms of them like addressing it, was just like treating it as though like my relationship with a woman that I was talking about is no different than the relationship I have with a guy. Of course, like just treating it as though like that is something that's natural. If in the chance that someone was uncomfortable with it, like a therapist, I would prefer that they tell me like in person, like, oh, like I have different faith beliefs, and so I don't feel comfortable talking to you about this. But here, let me refer you to someone who I think would be better able to address your needs. They don't even have to mention the fact that they like disagree with me on something or like one of my identities. It could just be like, hey, like I don't know if I'm like the best fit for you, so maybe like putting you over here would be or referring you to someone else would be a better option for you. And really just like treating the clients as people, of course, bottom line, and just making sure that they understand that you are there for them, of course. And if at any point they feel like uncomfortable talking about something, like that can be the time or opportunity for them to at least mention it, so that you can help them access resources that will help them increase their comfortability in talking about it as well. Yeah.
So not pushing, but at least making the space available to them.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and also, of course, like not forcing your own like beliefs or anything onto that person, or even just like in the chance that perhaps like you are speaking to someone who is of color and they're talking about like an instance where they feel as though they were being racially profiled, and the psychologist or mental health professional doesn't fully like understand where they're coming from, or like the connection between the two, like the incident and then the racial profiling, how that client came to that conclusion. I think just asking for like points of clarification, and then on their personal time being able to educate themselves about why their client was like uncomfortable, or like why that instance of someone saying like, oh, you're kind of like an Oreo, for example, or kind of like, well, or like say someone's bisexual and they're like, but you don't really like women though, right? Because you're with a guy. Like just being able, if someone doesn't understand like why that is problematic or why that could cause someone stress in any way, taking the personal time to, again, like educate yourself and invest in understanding more about your client and your patient.
So it's okay when they come in to maybe not always know the right answers to those things, but to be open.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the most important thing. Just being able to have the conversation. And if the person feels comfortable answering questions that you have, like feel free to ask them, but also definitely acknowledge that you want to give them the space to also not talk about it, because it may be undue burden or undue stress that can cause those types of questions. But yeah, just continuing the conversation.
Yeah. So I guess that brings up to the next question of how do we balance cultural sensitivity without oversubscribing someone's culture as the reason for why they're going through things?
That's a great question. And I'm not sure I necessarily like have like the full answer. I think it comes again down to education, and making sure that you can check your own biases and understanding that like, oh, like someone isn't gay because they were like assaulted when they were young. Like like being able to understand that like people are born this way. And I'm sure like, and of course, like maybe like them being queer and assaulted definitely impacts their relationships with people, both physically and emotionally, but being able to separate the two and understand that causation doesn't always, or correlation doesn't always equal causation in that sense. Yeah, I think that's the main thing. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, definitely. And I think like thinking about how some mental health issues kind of present differently with different groups, but not always. So the idea of like being okay asking that person, is this related to this or not? Is that something that you think is appropriate?
I think that is absolutely appropriate, because you're just repeating what they said, and asking for clarification, and you're also making sure that you understand where they're coming from. So I think that's a great way to make sure that you and your client are on the same page, and you're able to follow along with their experience and their story and what's going on.
Absolutely. So in that, what level of advocacy, because we've talked about how allyship is passive and not really enough.
Yes.
The advocacy is necessary, but what amount of advocacy do you think is sufficient for a mental health care provider?
I don't know if there even is like a level, because I understand that different people do advocacy in different ways, like whether that is being super involved on social media and making sure that they're reposting all the articles that they're reading and sharing information that way, or whether that is sending out like a newsletter to their clients, or making sure that they're taking the time to like educate themselves and educate the people around them. It doesn't necessarily always have to be like on social media or them physically being like in the protests every single day or every time it pops up. But it is also like, I think voting is a bare minimum. If you have the ability to vote, you should definitely do it and exercise your right to do so in the US, and educate yourself about the people who are running and doing those things and what their values are, and not being afraid to like reach out to them and being like, hey, what is your like response to climate change, or like how do you view this like recent LGBTQ policy that was passed, because it's their job to respond to you. So I think at the bare minimum, this is a great question. Voting definitely needs to happen, and being involved like politically, which I know can be an intimidating space for some folks, but definitely bare minimum that needs to happen. And then from there, it's really just like making sure that you are continuing to find the resources that you need to make sure that you are as knowledgeable about something as possible, or just like being curious and keeping that curiosity alive and well in your practice and in just like your personal life. Like if someone has this like article, maybe that is more of a conservative point of view necessarily, versus someone with a more liberal point of view, being able to understand like, okay, well, this person is coming from this place, and being able to have that open discussion of to like maybe why that isn't like necessarily the best point of view for like a human rights standard, but also being able to, yeah, just continue the conversation and understand that different points of view are always going to occur. Like even people within the Black Lives Matter movement, for example, have different views on like the way that advocacy should happen. But at the end of the day, they're all part of one movement, and they're not necessarily wrong. They just have different opinions. So voting and continuing to educate themselves and advocate for others, I think is like the best way. And that can obviously take on multiple different forms. So, yeah.
So that definitely brings up the question of what is the line between having a differing opinion and having an opinion that is not acceptable, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think tuning into like, I think cancel culture, even though it can be it's obviously pretty toxic, can be helpful in terms of identifying like what things are readily like, oh yeah, we're not going to support this person anymore, they're canceled per se, as well as just like listening to what society is saying about like a certain individual or like why they agree with someone. I think anything bottom line that infringes upon like the human rights and safety of an individual need to be established and upheld. So if someone is receiving stress from a just like an article hearing about like a politician saying like, oh yeah, like they can do like a false pregnancy and then the baby just like won't exist anymore. Like that's stressful for like women or people with uteruses. So being able to understand that like, yeah, just being able to understand that those are very different things versus having an opinion on like how police should like how the police force should be structured, for example, is a really big question that's happening right now, and like what needs to happen in terms of support. So it's really diving into like educating yourself, of course, on like why police exist. They exist to they existed mainly to like target people of color, mainly runaway slaves and people who were owned by others. So understanding those origins and understanding the history of like police brutality with people of color or any minorities in general is super important to understanding how you need to like reframe the structure of something to make it more applicable to people in a way that is healthy for as many people as possible. And is acceptable, as opposed to giving into those forms of like racism and just other forms of prejudice and systemic oppression that we have. So.
So when you encounter people who maybe have opinions that are not acceptable, what are ways that you can engage in those conversations?
Yeah, so I've been thinking of like the time when I talked to like someone who was a Trump supporter. So, which is like a pretty big one. I did not vote for Trump, nor will I in this upcoming election, but being able to understand like what their priorities were, which were the economy. They also wanted someone who would be able to put like a fresh spin on things, because he is very much, because Trump at the time was very much a political outsider, didn't really have a lot of political experience, but supposedly had a lot of like business experience. Whether he was successful or not, sorry about that, whether he was successful or not is up to debate and interpretation, but understanding what their values were and what was important to them. And understanding, of course, like they're people, like at the end of the day, even if they have a differing opinion from me or from like a group of people that I connect with, they're still at the end of the day human. And everyone is entitled to their own opinion and freedom of speech and everything. But as long as it doesn't end up harming or abusing other people in the process, I think is the most important distinction. And hopefully having the conversation with someone and hopefully being able to help them understand, like, for example, like talking to said Trump supporter about why like I did not support them, and about like the rights that Trump supported that would infringe upon my rights as an individual. And whether or not that person takes what I say or what anybody says into consideration is completely up to them. But yeah, if I'm in this right mindset and in the right space emotionally to be able to have that conversation, then I say have it. But if someone is already like super stressed out about everything that's going on, having that conversation that may potentially be very emotionally charged may not always be the best time. So finding the space and time to do so is super important. And also like, I know there's a lot of like Facebook discussions that occur like between people maybe from like your high school who like don't agree with you politically. So just like taking the time to like, of course, like feel free to message like them publicly, like on the post that they sent, but also message them privately and be like, hey, like, I just want to have a discussion about this and like why you view it this way. Because then that way, like you can both take the time that you need to craft what you want to say, how you want to say it, and also not necessarily remove yourself emotionally from it, but don't give like the first reaction that you have, which is like, you're a jerkwad and but actually like back it up with like your point of view and your experience and facts that support it. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. So what do you say to people who think that being neutral or trying to make everybody feel comfortable in a situation, like what would you say to that?
So I think that doesn't exist. Like people who are neutral are just siding with the oppressor, or the of the opinion that that is like hurting other people. So what makes people comfortable is feeling advocated for. And I think it's important for people to understand the ways in which that they submit themselves to like oppressive movements. Like, for example, like saying, like say you're in like a support group and someone says, yeah, but like I don't see color, like that's a problem, and making sure that they understand like outside of the group like what they said was problematic, how they can address it moving forward, is super, super crucial, because there's no such thing like, if you can't advocate for the rights of people who are oppressed, then you are part of the problem. And if you're not willing to open up yourself to being able to learn from the experience of others whose experience doesn't match yours, you are again part of the problem. So keeping that discussion open and honest is super crucial. And just being able to, and if people don't want, because not everyone is necessarily in the space to be like, oh, like, I'm self-actualized, I understand that what I said was hurtful, here's what I can do to correct it. Not everyone is always in that space. So helping them to find a space that they are more comfortable in, but that they can also grow from, is super crucial. And I know that's not always easy for a lot of people, but also making sure that you have the boundaries set, like in the social support group situation, for example, like, hey, like what you said was very uncomfortable and incorrect. So let's do what we can to address it. So set those boundaries ahead of time, so that to make sure that everyone is feeling respected and feeling heard. And that if there is like a difference in opinion or something, feel free to facilitate that conversation as like a mental health professional. But also just make sure that the rights of those who are being infringed upon are as maintained as possible as well. Yeah.
So the bare minimum being, you have to be an advocate for the rights of everybody.
Absolutely.
And any conversation from there is just being better.
1000%. Because being passive or being neutral or just like watching something as it happens isn't doing anything to take action or solve what's going on. It's just letting it happen, which can be incredibly harmful for a lot of people. So taking a step in, and it can just be like, hey, let's talk about this later, or like, hey, like what you said was really hurtful, let's regroup after. Like, it doesn't have to be some big like showmanship of like, what you said was racist and these are the sources that I have to back it up. It can just be something that seems very small but also has like a big impact in the long run.
And showing that compassion and providing an education without creating a defensive situation seems to be the best way to kind of deal with that kind of intensity.
Absolutely. And also very much meeting people where they're at, and helping them grow, so that because of course not everyone always wants to be in like that uncomfortable space of growth, but being able to touch and go and see what they are ready for in terms of like moving forward and being more supportive of other people. Like, where are they at, and what do they need to get to a better space and a space of growth? Super important. But I think that's also what therapy and like mental health is. Like, what does that person need to do to get to a better place emotionally, physically in their life? So y'all are already doing the work. It's just necessarily like sometimes framing it a little bit differently, but yeah, it's already being done, which is great.
Awesome. Do you have any parting thoughts before I leave you off on that?
Let me see you from my notes real quick, because I took some stuff that I wanted to say, but I think I pretty much covered everything that I wanted to say. Oh, I think another thing is like, I think a big barrier as well to people not accessing therapy may be like anticipated cost. So apart from not necessarily like seeing themselves in the space or knowing like a therapist or mental health professional who kind of looks like them or has identifying factors like them, just really understanding like insurance and the cost associated with it can be a big barrier. So making sure that mental health professionals have like a list of groups or organizations or people or businesses in the mental health field that can really like help support someone who may be financially limited, or even opening up their own time to provide like half cost sessions or free sessions for that person. So not just educating yourself, but knowing about like the resources available so that you can help people, because everyone is deserving of quality healthcare. It's just some people don't always know how to access it. So alleviating those barriers when possible is great as well. Yes, yes.
So great.
But I think that's it in terms of questions that I had. Did you have any more questions or things?
I think that we covered most of the things that I wanted to talk about today. So thank you so much for talking to me today about
Of
this.
course, it was such a pleasure. Thank you for having me.